Hi YouTube, this is Neil Fox, otherwise known as James Neil Fox, creator of the Lucifer series on YouTube, and this will be a video response to Luciferian Ideology and Black Magic in Practice by Michael W. Ford. That's a YouTube video circulating now, a very recent one. This is Michael's big book, The Bible of the Adversary. It's the only book of his that I've read. It was only until I did read it that I realized I couldn't call myself a Luciferian. Until then, I had a kind of enthusiasm, an early enthusiasm for his YouTube videos. I thought, I could co-opt that term for myself in a loose and general way, Luciferianism. All right, but it just hasn't worked out. And now that he's done a video about, point for point as to why, this is his ideology, what he's about, and why. It's a 21-minute video. I thought I would respond to it, not so much because, Michael will watch this. I don't care if he watches it. I don't care if he posts it. But people have asked me about the term Luciferianism from the very beginning, and I've talked to people one-on-one in personal messages about it. But I've never done a video. And I've done a video on LaVey. I've done a video on Satanism in general. I've made my distinctions there. But I've never made my distinctions until now with this, because Michael never made a video where he's just going from one talking point to the next in the bare bones. Now he's done that. Okay, let's just go down the list here of what he calls his ideology. First and last, he's against Judeo-Christianity, wages a polemic against it, calls it a cult of death, meaning that you'll only live happily ever after once you're dead. He describes the Luciferian consciousness as being proudly and pridefully against ignorance, monotheistic supplication, and weakness of the mind. He would supplant that with polytheistic supplication along a Promethean line, the black flame. He talks about the metaphor of the black flame a lot in the first book. And then he rails again some more against hellbound propaganda of the Judeo-Christian mindset. And in the face of that, he wants to reestablish a new foundation for Luciferianism in the daemon, which is the oversoul. I have a feeling for my own oversoul. I prefer that term to daemon. The daemon is more imbued with the shadow self, with raw desire. Both Michael and I agree that needs to be balanced. For him, he says, to incorporate raw desire into your life, it has to be legal, useful, and meaningful. So that's how he qualifies that. He romanticizes the predator nature. He thinks we're all predators inside. Some people by their nature are not predators, but he sees that in nature. That's the model, and it's better to be a predator than to be the prey. And so still keep with balance, otherwise the predator becomes the prey, the hunter becomes the hunted. I would really be interested if Michael could explain the principle by which that does happen. He does acknowledge that it happens and that you have to be cautious on that account, but he never really explains why giving in to the predator nature, if it's so cool, if you do it in an uninhibited, mindless kind of way, that you're going to end up in prison. That it's self-destructive. Okay, why is it self-destructive if it's so natural? All right. The Marquis de Sade got into these contradictions too, as to what's that all about? Okay, giving way to every impulse, what's that about? Why is it self-destructive? If that's how you are, if that's what's inside, if that's what's natural, then why is it so self-destructive? He just has, I don't really honestly think Michael's thought through a lot of stuff, but he is articulate, he's interesting, and he approaches the subject with a lot of dignity. So, I mean, I'm not putting him down. I just don't necessarily always relate to where he's coming from. He acknowledges that to be so against Judeo-Christianity is to be defined by what you're against, and he doesn't want to dance to the Christian beat. But I can't help but feel that his thinking does dance to the Christian beat. I think he's more solidly sure of what he's against than what he's for. And what he's for can only really be understood in the context of what he's defining himself against. Otherwise, it gets a little strained. I mean, he wants to resurrect the gods of ancient Assyria. Why Assyria? One of the most valid things about the Hebrew Tanakh, what we call the Old Testament in the Christian world, is that it's written from the perspective of the oppressed about their oppressors. They were oppressed by the Egyptians, they were oppressed by the Assyrians, and by the Babylonians, and by the Macedonians, and then the Romans. And you get this chronicle of generations after generations of being oppressed. And the guilt they get into it, blaming themselves for not pleasing their almighty God who keeps delivering them to their oppressors, and then what horrible people their oppressors were. The metric for any civilization is how it treats most of the people living under it. And in that sense, all the ancient civilizations fail. And we have an apt chronicle of that in the Tanakh, because whether these stories are exaggerated or not, we all know what an oppressed class goes through, and we can only imagine what an oppressed class went through without even the benefit of technology to ease their labors. Okay, because we know how bad it is even with that technology when you're that crassly oppressed and enslaved. So I can't help but feel that resurrecting all of these gods indiscriminately, is just resurrecting reflections and archetypes of a proto-fascistic system of thought. Okay, the Assyrian state was an oppressor state. Whatever else its accomplishments, it was an oppressor state. The ancient world, by its nature, had to exploit and oppress people to make them do all the work, while you cultivated armies to keep everybody in line. And you had your merchant class, and then above them was the aristocracy and the ruling family. So you want to model your gods off of socio-political systems this primitive? I don't find it very attractive at all. Okay, Satanists want to go to Rome, they want to go to Assyria, they want to go to Babylon, to anything that the Jews demonized. Well, the Jews demonized it because they were getting beaten over the head by these people, and so they called their gods names and demonized them and called those gods devils. And sure, there were attributes of those gods that got demonized to an extent that we in the West for centuries were demonizing the sexual impulse. We were demonizing things that really ought not to be demonized. And so in incorporating the shadow and integrating it into our ego personalities, we are actually integrating things that are positive, not negative, but that we've denied ourselves. But we have to integrate it in a balanced fashion. Otherwise, we will, as Michael concedes, be destroyed by it. Rooted in what he calls the daemon, that I would call the oversoul. The Seth material talks about the oversoul. I certainly have experienced my oversoul. I don't talk that much about it. I allude to it a little bit in some of the videos. Prophecies of Lucifer 6 and its follow-ups a little bit, but not a lot. I kind of shy away from talking about these inner experiences because they can be dismissed as fantasy, and not everybody has a faculty for it. Gurdjieff plays a big role in the Lucifer series, and that's about being here and now, okay, in the immediate here and now, physically, emotionally, and mentally, and anything that's taking you out of the now becomes ideally fuel, okay, that you roll with and learn from and advance with. Okay, I don't think Michael would have that much of a problem with any of that, but Gurdjieff was concerned about different types of people, and not all types of people would take, I think, to his particular inward approach. In fact, Gurdjieff closed the door to the inwardness thing. He just whatever's right in front of you, and it's life, okay, and it's happening and it's coming at you, and what are you going to do about it? My process goes back and forth between the inner now and the outer now, okay, and they reinforce each other. They keep each other real, and I do it that way. But I do understand Gurdjieff making it as extroverted as he did in order to include everyone. And that is the true foundation for knowledge in the consciousness sense. All right? It would have to include everyone. All right? That's why I would prefer Buddhism to Hinduism, and I would take anything I like from Hinduism and understand it in a Buddhist framework, a Taoist framework, where the gods are just completely deconstructed. Because the gods do, in India, reflect a caste system, a system based on race and apartheid, and if we were to give it a modern word. There are these problems when you personify things. You say more about yourself and more about your society and your environment than you do about anything that's really objectively there. And then there was war. Satanists and Luciferians tend to have a real romance about war. The predator is warlike. The Luciferian is described by Michael as warlike but peaceful when need be. When I was younger, I took karate to get past people pushing me around, and I built confidence, and I got into a few real fights, and I did okay, and so I eventually had less and less to prove, and I moved on from there. For me, that's just a stage, okay, and that's as much of the war god thing as I needed or ever care to need. But what it's like for some other people, I don't know. I mean, some people just live there with this, and they even think it's a literal war god they're tapping into, an actual personality or something. That just gets pretty psychotic. But it all kind of falls apart with the ego. It really does. That gets so fundamental. I don't believe that you can be in an egoless state 24/7. I mean, it's just not possible. It's not what the Eastern mystics are really doing, even though they talk in those terms. It's really very misleading. But it really helps to be able to be capable of an egoless state now and then, to get your bearings and to get a gauge on reality. Okay, the ground of being, where all of this energy is really coming from. And Michael is really stuck in the ego space, okay? The ego tends to be supreme in his philosophy, so it's puzzling how he can talk about tapping into different kinds of energies when, to me and in my experience, the ego is always in the way, okay? The ego has to become more fluid, more collaborative, and more cooperative with the larger portion of the brain, of which it's just a tiny fraction, okay? You're just talking about a shell, a personality that is very extremely relative, okay? And then there's the rest of your brain, this vast universe that's unexplored, and the ego is usually its own barrier to all of that. So it's an aggregate of thoughts and reflexes and reactions. He wants to develop that personality. He wants to integrate it with the shadow, and he wants access to the unconscious. I guess in a kind of a Jungian sense, I would assume, and I've been there with that, and I know what that is. But I mean, compared to what Gurdjieff is talking about, and compared to what Eastern philosophy is talking about, hey, man, I mean, that's just like, maybe 3 steps above being a born-again Christian. I mean, born-again Christians take a trip to Catalina, and that's the ultimate paradisal vision of all things. I'm on Catalina Island. That's the big high point of my life. And for Michael, it's not as bad as all that. He's not. He's in Hawaii. But, Gurdjieff's talking about interstellar travel.